The Alpha King's beast brought her a motionless pup. What happened next left everyone speechless. Nobody in the village had ever seen anything like it. And honestly, nobody wanted to either. Riva had lived alone at the edge of Coldfen Forest for almost 4 years. She wasn't the kind of person who went looking for trouble. She kept to herself, grew herbs in her little garden, and spent most evenings reading by the fire. Quiet life, safe life. Exactly the kind of life she had chosen after everything that had fallen apart a few years back. She had a son once. Well, she still had him, technically. But after a custody case she couldn't win, she only got to speak to him on the phone once a week. That kind of pain doesn't go away. It just becomes something you carry around with you, like a stone in your pocket. Heavy, but quiet. So yes, Riva was used to silence. She was used to hard nights and empty rooms. But nothing had prepared her for what showed up at her door at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday. She heard it first. Not a knock, not a bark. Just this low, heavy scraping sound on the wooden porch steps. Like something being dragged, or something dragging itself. She grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer, told herself it was probably a deer, and opened the front door. It was not a deer. What stood on her porch was the biggest wolf she had ever seen in her life. And she had seen wolves before. She used to work in wildlife rehabilitation before everything fell apart. She knew what wolves looked like. She knew their size, their build, the way they held themselves. This was not like any of that. This animal was enormous, taller than her at the shoulder, fur the color of ash and shadow, soaked through from the rain that had started maybe an hour ago. Its eyes, and this was the part that made her breath stop. Its eyes were almost human, not in a creepy way, in a way that said, I know exactly what I am doing right now, and in its mouth, held with a gentleness that seemed impossible for something that size, was a pup. Tiny, silver-furred, completely still. The wolf stepped forward, lowered its head slowly, and placed the pup on the porch boards in front of her feet. Soft, careful, like it was setting down something made of glass. Then it looked at her, one long, steady look, and walked back into the trees. And the forest swallowed it whole, and it was gone. And there was nothing left but the rain and the tiny pup lying on her porch, and Riva standing in the doorway with a flashlight, and no idea what had just happened to her life. She should have called someone, she knew that. Animal control, a wildlife center, anyone. Instead, she picked the pup up, wrapped him in a towel, and carried him inside. Old habits. He was barely breathing. His gums were pale, his body was cold, and every few seconds he would shiver in this small, heartbreaking way. She had seen animals in this state before. Some of them made it. Some of them didn't. The difference, usually, came down to one thing, whether someone decided to stay up all night fighting for them. Riva decided. She fed him warm fluids through a dropper every 2 hours. She kept him against her chest when his temperature dropped, because body heat was the simplest thing she could give. She whispered to him, quiet, ridiculous things, like you're going to be fine, and stop being dramatic. And I didn't stay up all night for you to give up now. She named him Ash. She knew she shouldn't name him. She named him anyway. On the first morning, he was still alive. On the second, he was slightly less cold. On the third night, she almost fell asleep in the chair beside him. And when she opened her eyes, he was watching her with these ice-blue eyes that were too calm, too knowing, for a pup that had been half dead 2 days ago. She stared at him. He stared back. Okay, she said. Okay, you're going to be strange, aren't you? She didn't notice, those first 3 nights, that something was watching from the tree line. Still, patient, enormous. The knock came on the 4th morning, just after sunrise. She opened the door and found a man standing on her porch, tall, dark coat. Standing very still in the way that people stand when they are trying not to take up too much space, but their presence takes it anyway. He looked like someone who gave orders for a living, and had forgotten that some people didn't take them. My name is Caleth, he said. I've come for the pup. Riva leaned against the doorframe. Is he yours? A pause. He belongs to my family. He's not ready to be moved. I'm aware you've been caring for him. I'm grateful. But he needs to come home now. He needs to eat properly for another week at least, and his temperature regulation is still off. If you move him in this cold, you'll undo everything. Another pause. Longer this time. He looked past her into the cottage, and she watched something shift in his expression. Not softness exactly, something more like, Recalculation. "May I come in?" he asked. She should have said no. Every sensible part of her knew that. "Wipe your boots," she said, and stepped aside. He sat at her small kitchen table, and she put tea in front of him, and they talked. Really talked. Which surprised her, because she had expected him to be the kind of man who explained things at people rather than talking with them. He told her what Ash was. Not a normal wolf. The pup came from a bloodline that was old, he said. Rare. His mother had been killed in a conflict between rival groups. He chose his words carefully and she noticed, but she didn't push. She had the sense she was hearing as much as he was willing to give, and that pushing would only close the door. She told him she used to do wildlife rehabilitation, that she'd stopped a few years ago, that she had moved out here for the quiet. He didn't ask why she'd stopped. She appreciated that. From across the room, Ash lifted his head, spotted Kalith, and made a sound. Not quite a whimper, not quite a word, something in between, and Kalith went very still. Riva watched his face. He looked like someone who had been handed something he didn't know how to hold. He didn't take Ash that day, he came back the next day, and the day after that. Nobody could figure out why the Alpha King kept going back to the cottage at the edge of the forest. His brother Darren, sharp-eyed, suspicious, and loyal in the specific way that made him dangerous, brought it to the council's attention after the 5th visit. There were rules, he said. Old rules about contact between outsiders and their kind. This was irregular. This was a risk. Kalith listened to all of it and said he would handle it. He did not stop going to the cottage. What was happening there was hard to explain, even to himself. He would show up and sit at that small kitchen table, and they would talk about Ash's progress, and then they would somehow end up talking about other things. Real things. The kind of things you don't say out loud when you're in a position of power, because showing people what costs you something is the same as handing them a weapon. But Riva didn't seem interested in weapons. She seemed interested in truth, and she offered it so plainly herself that it became difficult not to offer it back. She told him about her son one evening, not the whole story, just the shape of it, that she had him, and then she didn't, and now she talked to him on Sundays and tried to make 7 minutes feel like enough. She said it simply, without asking for anything, and then poured more tea and changed the subject. Kalith sat with that for a long moment before he said that he understood something about carrying a loss you're not allowed to set down. His had a different shape, but the weight, he said, was recognizable. It was the most honest thing he had said to anyone in years. Darren came to the cottage himself 2 weeks in. He came with 2 others, and he was polite, pointedly, carefully polite, and told Riva that her time with the pup had been generous and was now complete. She would be compensated for her trouble. The pup would be leaving today. Riva looked at him for a moment. "Come in," she said. "I'll make tea." He hadn't expected that. He came in. She made tea, and then she spent 30 minutes walking him through exactly what stage of recovery Ash was at, what he still needed, what the risks were of disrupting that recovery too early, in the same calm and detailed way that she might explain it to someone who actually cared about the answer. Darren left without the pup. But when his car disappeared down the road, Riva sat down on the kitchen floor and put her back against the cabinet and stayed there for a while. Because she was not stupid. She knew this was borrowed time. She had always known. She was good at recognizing things that couldn't last. She had years of practice with that particular skill. The problem was that somewhere in the last 2 weeks, she had forgotten to keep her distance. And now Ash was climbing up onto her lap and licking her chin, and she was going to have to give him back. And Kalith was going to stop coming to the cottage, and the stone in her pocket was going to feel heavier again. She scratched behind Ash's ears and told herself she was being ridiculous. He tilted his head at her in exactly the way that meant he disagreed. The night it all came apart and came together at the same time started with Riva packing a bag, Ash's bag, his blanket, his feeding schedule written out on a card, the specific formula she'd been using, notes on his temperature patterns, everything anyone would need to take over his care. She was folding the blanket when she heard the knock. Kalith came in and looked at the bag on the table and didn't say anything for a moment. "He's ready," Riva said, "or close enough. You should take him now, before it gets harder." "Harder for who?" She didn't answer that. He sat down. Not in the chair this time, on the edge of the table, which he had never done before. Closer, like the usual distance had become inconvenient. What my wolf did, he said slowly. The night he brought Ash here, that doesn't happen. In the entire history of my bloodline, that animal has never once acted on its own. Not once. It follows my lead. It has always followed my lead. Until that night. Until that night. Riva looked at him. Why are you telling me this? Because I need you to understand that he chose you. Not randomly. Not by accident. That animal is old, and it is not wrong about people. It has never been wrong about people. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'm someone who people leave. I've had a lot of practice making it easy for them. He looked at her steadily. I'm someone who stays until I'm forced out. You can ask anyone. It was such a simple thing to say, such a completely ordinary sentence. But she felt it land somewhere in her chest and stay there. And she thought, a little helplessly, a little too late, oh, that's trouble. The next morning, Kalith called a full assembly. Everyone came, the elders, the council, the senior members of the pack, people who had known Kalith since he was a boy, people who had watched him become something formidable and occasionally frightening, people who had very strong opinions about protocol and bloodlines, and what was and wasn't appropriate. Darren stood near the front. He had been waiting for this. He was sure this was the moment everything got corrected and put back the way it was supposed to be. The doors opened. Kalith walked in, and beside him, one step behind, Riva walked in with Ash in her arms. The silence was the kind that has weight to it. Darren's expression shifted through several things in quick succession. Kalith stood in front of all of them, and did something he rarely did. He told a story. Not a speech, a story. He told them about the night his wolf crossed the border, something no alpha's wolf had ever done unprompted. He told them what Ash had been, dying, abandoned, the last of his mother's litter. He told them about the woman who opened her door at 2 in the morning, and did not run, and did not call anyone, and spent 3 nights keeping a pup alive who had no particular reason to want to live. He told them that his wolf knew something he had been too stubborn to admit for 2 weeks. The eldest member of the council, a woman named Thessaly, who was somewhere between very old and ancient, and had not approved of anything since the previous decade, looked at Ash. Ash, who had climbed from Riva's arms, and was now sitting against Kalith's leg, with the calm certainty of an animal who knows exactly where it belongs. Thessaly said, The old blood does not lie. It has not lied in 400 years. I see no reason it has started now. She sat back down, and that, more or less, was that. Darren opened his mouth, closed it again. For the first time in his life he couldn't find the objection that mattered enough to say out loud. Things didn't change all at once after that. That's not how real things change. Ash started spending days at the pack's home, and evenings at the cottage, and then he started making noise about that arrangement by howling at the cottage door every time Riva wasn't there, until the howling became so consistent and so dedicated that it was easier to just have Riva there. She brought her books, then her herb bundles, then her reading lamp, because the lighting in the guest room was terrible. Nobody asked her to bring these things. She just did, gradually, and nobody asked her to stop. Kalith helped her file a new petition with a human-side lawyer about her son. He didn't make a big thing of it. He mentioned that he knew someone. She said she'd think about it, and 3 days later she said yes. It was the most quietly significant thing she had ever agreed to. Darren took about 2 months to come around. He never said sorry exactly. But one morning he showed up with coffee and sat down across from Riva, and said, The pup seems healthy, in the tone of someone extending a flag of peace disguised as small talk, and Riva accepted it in exactly that spirit. Thessaly watched all of this from a distance, and occasionally nodded to herself in the way of someone whose suspicions have been confirmed. Winter came, the forest got quiet. Ash grew, fast, the way pups do, going from small enough to hold in one hand to suddenly crashing into furniture and looking surprised about it. Riva started laughing more, not performing it, actually laughing, the kind that catches you off guard. Kalith started leaving meetings early. His council noticed. They decided not to mention it. And in the evenings, when the fire was going and Ash had finally worn himself out and fallen asleep stretched across both their feet like he owned the floor, the two of them would sit in the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty anymore. The kind that feels like, finally, like exhaling something you'd been holding for so long you'd stopped noticing. People asked Riva later. Her friend Nadia asked, The lawyer asked. Even Darren eventually asked. What it was like. That first night. The wolf. The pup. The door in the rain. She always said the same thing. She said she didn't think about whether it made sense. She just saw something small and broken that needed help. And she had 2 hands, so she helped. That's the thing about people who have been through real loss. They don't waste time asking if something is worth saving. They already know the answer. They learned it the hard way. Ash, for his part, never once seemed confused about any of it. From the very first night, he had known something that the rest of them were still catching up to. Like they can see the ending from the very beginning, and they just have to wait for everyone else to arrive. The village people, the ones who lived at the edges and caught glimpses of things they couldn't explain, talked about it for a long time. The night the great wolf came down from the forest and knocked on a human woman's door. The Alpha King who kept showing up at a small stone cottage. The silver pup who ended up being the thread that stitched 2 impossible worlds together. They said you couldn't have planned it. You couldn't have written it. And that was true. The best things usually are. End.